Welcome to Church Unfiltered with Dr. Anthony Cobbs, a leadership podcast brought to you by Breakthrough Ministry Consulting.
Welcome to a new episode of Church Unfiltered. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Cobbs. Listen, I am so excited about this being our third episode. I feel like a veteran now at podcasting. We're 3 episodes in. We've received great feedback about the first 2 episodes that launched a few weeks ago. And if you have not heard them, please make sure you go back and listen to the first 2 episodes. But this is the third episode, episode number 3, and we are excited about it on today. Of course, we know that we are powered by Breakthrough Ministry Consulting. That is my consulting business. And if you are a pastor or a church leader, and if you are in need of any assistance in any kind, any way, please feel free to just give me a call or get in touch with me. I love to help pastors. I love to help church leaders to be able to think through their strategy and think through ministry development. Even in this current season, there is a need for consultation. The Bible tells us that in the multitude of counselors, there is safety. And so I encourage you to get in touch with me if you are in need of any assistance from Breakthrough Ministry Consulting. Well, this is episode 3. We're going to look at a few different things on today. We have one of our listener questions that we're going to look at, and then we're going to get into our subject matter. Today, our subject matter is the other side of normal, the other side of normal. Many of my pastor friends and clients we've been in discussion, and we've talked about how we are looking forward to getting back to normal. And so today's episode, I want us to look at the other side of normal, because there's some things that took place when everything was calm or everything was normal, as we say, that weren't exactly the best things. And so I just want to address that. I want us to look at that, because there's some things that we shouldn't want to get back to. Of course, all of us want to get back together and praise the Lord with the saints and gather together in our buildings. But there are some things that were part of our norm, part of our normal, if you will, that we definitely don't want to get back to. And so we want to look at that. But before we get into that, we have a listener question. One of our listeners, a minister from San Antonio, Texas, sent this question. And it's a good question. I like this question. How do you, as a leader, prepare for succession? How do you, as a leader, prepare for succession? Of course, succession meaning, how do you prepare for the next person who's going to follow you, or someone who's going to take your place eventually? How do you, as a leader, prepare for succession? That is a great question. Succession has been a hot topic in the past several years. There's a bunch of research, different books that have been written regarding succession and pastoral succession especially. But I think that it is important for us to answer this question even from the perspective of church staff, and not only just in a pastoral role. There's different books, again, that have been written about it. But one of my favorite books that I like to refer people to is a book called Next, N-E-X-T, Next, by William Vanderbloemen. William Vanderbloemen owns the Vanderbloemen Search Group that is out of Houston, and they are friends of mine. I've been able to meet with them and share some things with them, and they are truly a blessing in searching, helping churches to staff their needs with whatever their pastoral needs and different jobs that are available and everything. Vanderbloemen Search Group is a great source, great resource to be able to do that. But William Vanderbloemen wrote a book a couple of years ago called Next, and it is dealing with pastoral succession. And I encourage you to get that book, because it deals with a number of angles to look at, a number of facets to look at in reference to how do you prepare for the next person. And so that's a resource that I definitely encourage you to do. And I'll put that on our Facebook page. I'll put that on my Facebook page as well. It's called Next by William Vanderbloemen. But for me as a leader personally, in the role that I currently serve at a church, I'm a consultant, but I'm an executive pastor at a church. For me as a leader, succession begins with discipleship. It is going back to what Jesus told us to do. I'm a firm believer that the next person for most roles, if not all, is a person who has been properly trained equipped and empowered to do the job. It is discipleship. It is what Jesus did with his disciples. It is what Paul did with Timothy and Titus. It is succession. It is discipleship. It is preparing people for the next. If you ask anyone who is close to me, whether in the executive pastor role that I'm in or in other roles, I am always trying to teach what I am doing and why I am doing it. In the staff role I have right now, there are 2 or 3 people who I believe they could do my job. And I don't have a problem saying that. I don't have that. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it is a testament to leadership when you are comfortable with being able to pour into someone else and being able to trust someone else to be able to handle the roles and responsibilities that they have, and even sometimes that you even might have. It is the Moses and Joshua principle. It is understanding that there has to be another eventually. We can't be in this thing forever. So what I like to do is I like to pour into people around me. Again, I have 2 or 3 people that I'm constantly talking to, constantly pouring into them, helping them to be a better leader in the role that they serve. But I'm also giving them an understanding of how I operate. That way I can go on a vacation. That way I can eventually leave. I can do those things because I know that there are people who will be able to take the reins and be able to make sure that the organization is just as strong as it is if I was there or not. And so that's why it's important, but it takes someone to be confident in that. I'll never forget when I was a young youth pastor, I was brought down to San Antonio, Texas. To be a youth pastor. And I'll never forget the role that I played. I was the youth pastor and I was also the pastor of small groups at that church. And so, but I was the second man. There was no other pastors on staff. It was the senior pastor and myself. And I'll never forget the senior pastor saying something to me. I remember going to him one day and saying, I don't want to do too much because I don't want to come across like I'm trying to do your job. And he said something to me I will never forget. He said, the reason I hired you is because I know you can lead. If you couldn't do my job, if you couldn't do the things that need to be done to help run this church, then I wouldn't have hired you. Now that struck me and stayed with me and still sticks with me. He was so confident in who he was that he said, I would not even hire you. I need you to be the second man. So if you're the second man, I need you to be strong enough and have the skill set to be able to handle things if I wasn't there. And that's how we have to approach things. There ought to always be someone that we are pouring into, someone that we are lifting up, someone that we are helping to know how to do the job and to be equipped to be able to handle things if we were not there. That's how I approach succession. And again, I advise you to go and do some research and look at that. But succession begins with discipleship. That's what I want to make sure that I encourage you to find someone that you already are able to pour into. And here's the last thing I'm going to say about it. And we'll probably have an episode dealing with this very subject in the near future. It is amazing to me how when a pastor leaves or even a staff member, sometimes we do a search to go outside. Why do we go outside? Well, the reason we go outside of the church to search for someone, even though that person's going to have to learn the culture of the church, that person's going to have to learn the job and then learn the culture of the church. We tend to go outside. The reason is because we don't do a very good job of developing leaders. We have to develop leaders. When you develop leaders, it should be almost automatic that the person next in line is able to carry on what was already established. So that's what I believe. I believe that as succession begins with discipleship. So great question. We thank you. And if you have any questions, you who are listening now, if you have any questions for us that you want us to answer, we encourage you to send your questions in to info@breakthroughonline.org, info@breakthroughonline.org, and we will do our best to get your question answered. We have a lot of questions that people have sent in. That means a lot of people want to get an unfiltered answer, and that's what this podcast is all about. So let's get into today's content. Over the past several weeks, I've heard many pastors express a longing to get back to normal. The context of these sentiments usually refers to getting back to Sunday worship services, Bible studies, classes, and mission work. I even saw a post on Facebook, a humorous post that showed a man entering an auditorium that was jam-packed with people. People were clapping and shouting. And as he entered, he was super animated. He was high-fiving people as they clapped and cheered him on. He did a dance. I think he even did a cartwheel or two, and he pumped his fist in the air. He was beyond ecstatic. And the caption on the post simply said, "This is how every pastor will be when we get back to church." The idea is, and the image is simply that we are looking forward to getting back to being in church. And there's nothing quite like being gathered together with the saints of God and being able to praise and lift up the name of God together. Yeah, we all want to get back there. We want to be able to gather together. But one thing that I notice pastors saying and some leaders saying is that we want to get back to normal. And so what I have reminded pastors of, and I'm not coming in to bring them down and bring the hopes down. I mean, of course, we want to get back to the best of what church is. It is worship. It is serving. It is all those things. And we want to get back to that. But there are some things as a consultant, I'm talking to various pastors and I'm reminding them, you do remember that there were some things that had become normal in your pastoring, in your ministry, or in your life. There's some things that you really don't want to get back to. What's going to be the difference? And so that's when I'm challenging a lot of the pastors. There are several things. And so one pastor in particular was like, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? There's some things that I don't want to get back to. And I began to list a few things that he and I had talked about just within the past several months. And he was like, man, you know what? I didn't even think about that. I didn't even think about the fact that I was fighting with my deacons or I was struggling with a certain member and all of these things. He said, I didn't even think about all of that. And I said, yeah, that was part of your normal. You were trying to figure out how to get away from that, how to deal with that, how to overcome that. And look at you now. Look at us now. Now that is not even on the radar because things have shifted. So the thing is, how do we make sure that we remember and understand where we were to make sure that we don't go back there again in those negatives, in a negative sense? So there are some things, and that's why I call this the other side of normal. We want we want normal and even more and even better worship and serving. We want that. We want to get back to doing that, and we will. But we do not want the other side of normal. The other side of normal is church politics, pettiness, messiness. We don't want that. That's not the norm or the normal that we want to get back to. So I want to share with you just real quickly. I want to share with you four things. There's just four things that I've been discussing with pastors. I'm like, did you forget about this? Did you forget about this? And I think it's general enough to not just pastors, but ministry leaders, and even general enough to some of us who are in the marketplace, in the secular world, whether you work at a bank, whether you work in the education system. Some of us are facing some things or were facing some things that now in the past month, we haven't even dealt with these things because God has put us on a pandemic pause, if you will, and we aren't even dealing with some of the same things that we dealt with. So be careful when we say, when you say, I want to get back to normal. Do you really? Let's look at it. Let's look at these four things. There are four things that I want to highlight that I've talked to pastors and individuals with who are dealing with these four areas. The first one is depression. Depression. Just a few months ago, social media posts were staggered with statistics and stories related to the depression felt by pastors. You were seeing stories about pastors who committed suicide, pastors with moral failures, pastors with different things, seeing all these different things happening. And people were posting, we're going to pray for our pastors and our pastors, and putting the statistics out there. Pastors are depressed and pastors are this. You were seeing all of that in 2019, even into the beginning of this year. And now you don't see any of that. The reason you don't see any of that, of course, is because we have the pandemic going on. So you see that being covered, but you also don't see a lot of that because the problems have shifted. Things have changed. The pressure is not there like it was before. We have a different kind of pressure now, but you don't have the same type of thing. Let me see if I can remind us of that. Research clearly tells us that pastors were suffering from depression in staggering ways. And it doesn't mean that they're not now. It's just that things are different. Now the pandemic has taken prominence as far as in the news. Lifeway research suggests that as many as 1 in 5 pastors deal with a mental illness such as depression. Another study that was done in Canada, it came up with these results and these statements. And these findings, and I want to share these findings with you. I want you to listen carefully to what they say in the study. It said that 67% of those that were surveyed strongly agreed with the statement, "I sometimes project my job frustration on my family." 67% said, "I project my job frustration on my family." 62% strongly agreed with this statement. "Sometimes my outward appearance seems happy and content, while inside I am emotionally distressed." This is prior to the pandemic, you all. This was the norm. This was what was happening with pastors. This was what was happening with leaders. How many pastors, how many leaders, how many people in general were dealing with so much stress and so much depression because of their job? And this whole thing has shifted us in such a way where we're now saying we want to get back to normal. But wait a minute. The normal that we used to have included this type of behavior, included this type of emotion. But 75% agreed to this statement: "I am afraid to let my members know how I really feel." Wow. Can you imagine that? That was normal. 75%. That means that was normal. That 75% of the people who were surveyed said, "I can't even tell people about how I feel." And how many of us, we're hesitant to tell people that we're depressed, that we're hurting, that we're struggling, that we're dealing with something that we don't know how to break through. That was normal. So we want to return to normal. We don't want to return to this side of normal. We don't want to return to this part of normal. Depression is real, but that was part of the norm that was there prior to the pandemic. So that's one thing. The second thing that I want to highlight is that many pastors were stagnant. One of the best parts of my consulting and coaching job is I get to help pastors think through projects, strategy, and plans. It gives me joy to see the light come on when a pastor gets an idea or a spark to try something new. I love that. I love seeing when a pastor is excited, like, "Oh yeah, that's a great idea. Oh, we're going to do this and we're going to do that." They feel inspired to do something new. But the ugly side to that is I didn't see that very often. This is Church Unfiltered, and I'm being serious on this. I'm being unfiltered on this statement. Many of the pastors that I worked with, you didn't see that very often. You would see glimpses of that excitement, that, "Ooh, I got a fresh idea," or "Ooh, this is something great." Instead, what I saw too often was pastors who had run out of ideas. They were rehashing old ideas, old sermons, old projects, or they were imitating what they saw others doing. That was the norm. That was what I was seeing. That was what was happening on a regular basis. We want to get back to normal. Are we sure? Because a lot of pastors were stagnant. But in the past few weeks, I have spoken to pastors and heard the energy in their voices. I have seen them try new things, especially with streaming and building an online presence. There are churches that prior to the pandemic, beautiful, large churches, prosperous churches, it seems like, but yet they had no online presence. They had no intention of even focusing in on streaming and the quality of the streaming look. But now they are everywhere. They're all over the world. They've been broadcast. The word of God is going forth because there is something that this pandemic, and I'm not trying to give it glory, if you will, but it is this pause. Let me say that this pause that is a result of the pandemic has triggered something. It has caused creativity to rise up in pastors who are stagnant. We want to get back to normal. But the reality is that for some pastors, not all, for some, depression was the norm. Being stagnant was the norm. Then the third one, personal struggles was the norm. Now, we all have issues, things we deal with that maybe no one knows about. We deal with all kinds of stuff. I mean, people have all kinds of stuff. I myself, I'm dealing with fluctuating weight. I mean, this weight is just, it's these 30 pounds just will not go anywhere. And the fact that I keep eating those cookies is not helping it. Personal issues. But here's the reality. I know that for me, my weight gain started when I started wrestling with and dealing with the loss of my mother. I know that without a shadow of a doubt, that I need to deal with that in order for me to be able to handle other areas of my life. But how many pastors, how many leaders, how many of you, whether you're a church member, whether you're someone that's just listening in, no matter what it is that you have, staff member, what personal struggles do you have? This pause that is caused by the pandemic, maybe it's God giving us an opportunity to deal with some personal issues, some struggles that we have. I mean, what else would we do? We as pastors, a lot of times we don't deal with our personal struggles because we don't want to tell anybody. Just like that survey said, we don't want to say that we're hurting, that we're struggling. But we tell our people to do it, but we don't do it. We tell our people if you're sick to go to the doctor. We even tell people now at this point, we tell them if you need to go to a therapist, go to a therapist. If you need to lose weight, go get a personal trainer. So why don't we do that ourselves? That's one of those normal things, normal ways we functioned prior to the pandemic. So when we say we want to go back, we got to remember there were personal struggles. And maybe what God is doing is giving us opportunity to deal with our personal struggles. Maybe you have family struggles. Maybe you have whatever it might be. Maybe you have financial troubles. Do you know how many pastors are financially strapped? And maybe now is the time to get it together, to figure out. Listen, there's all kinds of programs that are being offered for free where they weren't free before. Now is the time. You have time. You have time to be able to sit and listen to a class, take a seminar, whatever the case may be, and work on you. Personal struggles. If you're going to go back to normal, remember that personal struggles was there prior to the pandemic. And maybe God is giving you an opportunity to change that. The last one, the fourth one. So we talked about pastors being depressed, or there's depression, or leaders, or anyone, depression, stagnant, personal struggles. But then here's the final one, being burned out. Being burned out. I want to hang my hat on it. That's what we say in preacher word. We're going to want to hang my hat on this particular point. Burnout is one of those things that is so common. We have learned to live with it. We've learned to operate in it. Burnout is when we have lost the zeal, passion, or fervor for the job or the task that we hold. Each of us probably knows someone. We probably know someone. If it's not ourselves, we know somebody who is still in place. They're in position. They have authority. They have a job or responsibility, but yet they are burned out. Can I be honest with you? People who are burned out can be mean. You know anyone like that? Do you know that they are well past their prime, well past their effectiveness, and they are just plain mean because they're burned out? They're still operating, but they're burned out. Another sign of burnout is people will say, well, we didn't do it that way. Why do we have to do it? They're not open to innovation. They're not open to change because they are comfortable doing it the way that they used to do it. because they're trying to survive. Really, what's happening is that they're trying to survive their own burnout. When I think of burnout, I think of this metaphor. I think of driving while fatigued. You ever been driving somewhere when you are completely exhausted? When I used to be a church starting consultant, I used to drive all over Southeast Texas, visiting church planting pastors, to consult with them, to work with them, to see how their churches are doing. I remember long days and nights on the road in places I can't even recall the names of some of these places, some of these small towns. It was dark. It was 2-lane highways sometimes. And I was exhausted. There were times that I was exhausted. And I'm telling on myself, but it was one of the reasons why I'm not doing it anymore, because I remember there were days or there were nights when I was so exhausted, I was dozing, falling asleep at the wheel. And I begin to think about that when I think of burnout. I associate that with burnout. That is so similar to burnout, because burnout is like operating that vehicle when you are falling asleep, when you are not at your best. And driving like that, when you drive like that, when you're falling asleep, and I know some of you know exactly what I'm talking about, especially when it's a long, long trip and you're falling asleep. There's a few things about it. First of all, it's so irresponsible. It's so irresponsible when you drive while fatigued. You endanger people who are innocent and have nothing to do with you. So when I was doing that and I was falling asleep, not only was I endangering myself, of course, because I could crash and I could have killed myself or hurt myself. It was irresponsible because there could have been innocent people all on the road and I could have hurt all of them. It was irresponsible. But then driving like that is irrational. You know what we do? We begin to tell ourselves, when you're driving like that, you begin to tell yourself, I can make it 5 more miles. I can make it. Oh, I can make it to the town, or I'll make it this way, or I'll drive 1 more hour and this and that. It's irrational. We begin to tell ourselves that we can push ourselves even further than our bodies are telling us. Our body is telling us, no, you're tired. You need rest. That literally you can drive and you're falling asleep. It's telling you something. Your body's telling you something. It's irrational for us to think that we can keep going beyond what our body is telling us. And that's dangerous because it's going to take a toll on us some way or another. But then driving like that is also irreversible because of the damage that can be caused. What if you crash? What if you get into an accident, you hurt yourself? Maybe you don't even die, but you permanently hurt yourself. You injure yourself a certain way. What if you run into that family that's just trying to make their way home, or that elderly couple that's just coming from a nice night out? The damage you can do is irreversible. You can't get that back. You can't get that time back. You can't get any of that back. So it makes no sense to operate like that. When you operate in burnout, it is the same type of thing. It's not literally the same, but it's potentially there. You have the potential to cause damage that you cannot take back. You could operate in such a way that you are causing harm to innocent people, that you are causing harm to the zeal and the joy that someone may have to serve the Lord God. And because of your burnout, you scare them away. Because of your burnout, you cause them to see God a certain way. It's dangerous. Don't operate in burnout. But this is normal. This was normal. That so many leaders, pastors, church staff were operating in burnout. And that's what was normal. So maybe this pandemic pause is causing us to reevaluate and begin to assess. Maybe what God is doing is helping us to understand, don't go back to normal. Because in normal, you are operating less than what your best is, operating in burnout. So let's review. When you make plans to return to normal, you have to consider that there are some some normal things that were there, some normal hurdles that were part of some of our lives. Not all of us. We all have our own. But some of those were depression. Some of us were dealing with depression. Some of us were dealing with emotional stress. And that was normal. You don't want to return to that. Being stagnant. Some of us did not have the creativity that we had, so we were borrowing from others, or we were not giving fresh word to our congregation members, or we were just not being innovative, not offering ideas in our staff meetings, and not being fresh. Personal issues, whatever it might be, it could be anything, whatever personal issues, those hidden things or those unresolved things that we never dealt with, and then burnout. Are you operating like that person who is driving while falling asleep? How dangerous is that? These might not be your four. Maybe these are not your four. These may not be your four. Maybe you have something else. Maybe there's some other things. Maybe there's some things. But when we are talking about returning to normal, even returning to a sense of normalcy, let's make sure we understand what was there before, what God may be giving us an opportunity to take care of now. Let's deal with it. Let's make sure that we take some time to address it, but we have to start there. We have to acknowledge what was there before. Now things are different. Pastors are home with their families. Pastors are taking a break. They have energy. They are able to get some sleep. They're all of these things. Church staff, you're able to get you're able to get revitalized. You're taking time to read and to just take time to get to know yourself better. It's different. So do you want to really return back to the hustle and bustle of no time and burnout and all of these things? We have to really think about that. What is normal? Does God want us to return to normal? Or perhaps it is like the children of Israel when Moses delivered them from the bondage of slavery. They got out into the wilderness, and you know what they said? They said, we could have been back out. We could have been back in Egypt where we had 3 meals a day. They had forgotten the hardship because they were in a season. They were in the wilderness of uncertainty. They didn't know what to do. They were afraid. And so they began to think that where they came from was better than where God had taken them. And what about us, friends? Here it is. We are in the midst of a pause. And maybe what it is that God is telling us, think about where you were. Deal with some issues. Deal with the things that you need to deal with. And let's make sure that we don't return to the other side of normal. In our next episode, we are going to talk about how do we create a new normal. We're going to talk about that. We're going to deal with that. So how do we start thinking about a new normal? Listen, I know that there's going to be a bunch of material and resources out there that's going to talk. It's going to be a bunch of people trying to sell you things, telling you how to make your church better after the pandemic and all that. I want to focus in on you. I want to focus in on leadership, on pastors, on church staff. I want to focus in on volunteers. Because there's a new normal that we have to find. And some of us were on the verge, on the edge of burning out. And we don't want to go back there. And so that's what we need to talk about. We'll talk about that on the next episode. I hope something has been beneficial to you. I want you to just begin to think about what's your 4? Maybe these 4 are yours, but maybe there's something else. That God doesn't want you to return to that part of it. And there's some time that you have now to deal with it. So we hope that this has been helpful to you. And I'm just so excited about being able to even have this discussion. And the last thing is this, is that we can look at the way the children of Israel came out of bondage and were facing new obstacles. But he told them to be still and know that he is God. Perhaps this is God telling you and I, be still and know that he is God. Cast all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. Now is the time for us to deal with some things so that we can go into a new season with a new normal. I look forward to discussing that with you in our next episode. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast. Please tell a friend, share this with as many pastors and ministry leaders, church staff that you can find. We are excited. I've been getting great feedback about this. And so we love the opportunity to be able to come to you and talk to you about issues in the church unfiltered. May God bless you and keep you until the next time.
Thank you for listening to Church Unfiltered with Dr. Anthony Cobbs. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. For more resources related to today's topic, visit churchunfiltered.com or follow Dr. Anthony Cobbs on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.